Because the reality, of course, is that thousands and thousands of women are directly impacted by interpretations, whether they like it or not. It's not simply an intellectual exercise. Would you accept the point that people don't live in a vacuum and that somebody's cultural heritage will have some kind of bearing on how they view it?
Of course,
text?
No doubt about it. Culture plays a very important role in everything that we do. Islam did not come to destroy cultures. It came to complement cultures. It came to embrace all cultures, unless, of course, those cultures are rotten. If they are rotten,
where there's injustice,
of course,
came to
eliminate it, whether that's cultural or even religious.
So the question now is really that many Muslim women, I mean, you can't ignore the reality, many Muslim women are saying,
but I'm saying,
our lived experiences mean that because of the faith, not despite it, for in many ways they're liberated because of the faith, but there are still some interpretations which seem to allow men more authority.
I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding about interpretation. If somebody doesn't have the authority and understanding of the complete picture that Quran lays, as well as what the Prophet and the companions had interpreted it to be, interpretation could often be marred by their own bias and their own judgment. What we do as Muslims is, as soon as we are faced with a dilemma, we refer to the Quran. The famous hadith of Rasulullah, he said to Mu'adh ibn Jabal, when you go to Yemen, how will you rule the people? By the Quran. What if you don't find it in the Quran?
There's no contention on that.
No, but hang on.
But when it comes to words like daraba,
hang on a second.
Interpreted in such a very different way.
I want us to be very clear. How did Rasulullah interpret it?
Exactly.
So, did Rasulullah ever beat any of his wives? Never. Did any of his companions suggest that this verse is actually talking about physically beating up the companion of their wives? No.
So how would you explain that that's become such a common understanding?
Because of lots of culture. Male chauvinism, there is, of course. But
it's not culture, because this is through religious books.
No, it's not. And that's my issue. If they are contradicting the Quran, they can't be religious books. If I write a book tomorrow to say, and for example, there are isolationist views. I had a debate with a scholar once who said female genital mutilation is not only a strong sunnah, it should be practiced by all women. So I sat there baffled. He was trying to quote Quran and the sunnah to me left, right and center. So I said to him, did you know that female genital mutilation predates Prophet ﷺ? Even people of Saudi Arabia, it comes from African tribes. He goes, I didn't know that. If it's a predated practice that was only there and it wasn't eliminated, it doesn't mean we can't eliminate it. It means if it's wrong, if it's going to damage people, Islam makes it a requirement that we should do. Where my contention comes, Salma, is both with the scholarly, or the lady Margot who was speaking, and Shaista who mentioned about feminist interpretation. The word feminist is loaded. It's got a history. It's got a meaning. The moment we use loaded and historic terminologies, we also carry those history and those meanings. Let's give a new meaning to it. I'm quite happy. Why didn't we have female interpreters for the last 200 years within Islamic history? Why haven't we? That's a failure.
Margot would argue that we have.
No, but it's not true, because she talked about 1890 when a group of elite women came together to discuss certain issues. They may have come up with the right solution to do with the oppression that they were facing, but the elite group of people under Nasser, under Sadat, under Mubarak were not representatives of the masses of Muslims. And in fact, when you bring the scholars, there are good scholars within the Islamic world, together, nobody with their right mind would say oppression to women is allowed, subjugation of women is allowed, forced marriage is allowed.
In many ways, Saudis would say they're not oppressing women by not allowing them to drive. Nobody says they oppress people.
But majority of the scholars of the Muslim world would say the Saudi Arabian version isn't Islamic version. It is marred by Saudi royal family, politics, and other issues which need to be unpacked.
That sincere interpretation and how people are forced to live then according to those are marred by political and cultural
Correct. And that doesn't
context.
require, therefore, a feminist interpretation. What it requires is an enlightenment within ourselves, an intellectual progression together, not separate. The moment you say feminist, I think about masculinist somehow. The moment you talk about feminism, I think about emasculation of men. We can't go along like this.
That could be down to a stereotype.
Let's get rid of the label.
Okay, let's get rid. I mean, you've talked about why haven't there been interpreters for the last 200 years. First of all, the massive barrier was education. If you are not going to, I mean, women were not educated. There were not even girls' schools in many countries. So therefore, if they didn't have an education, they did not have the knowledge and the tools to challenge patriarchal texts. As soon as women were able to do that, they started to
You
then
keep on
challenge
saying
from within.
patriarchal text. What is that?
Well, we probably need a whole program
No,
to
but
discuss
patriarchal
that.
text doesn't solve the issue of getting rid of the labels.
Discriminatory text
Yeah, so it's not
against
patriarchal,
women.
discriminatory. Let's use the right terminology.
Actually, the correct
both,
terminology
yeah.
would be, if it's to do with gender-type discrimination, patriarchal.
Because Quranic interpretation is not
Patriarchal-
gender-based. Quranic interpretation is gender-neutral.
I think what you're hearing
Not
from a lot
the
of
men
people.
that, you
Yes.
need to, what I think needs to happen is, I think scholars and imams like yourself probably need to work more closely with women's groups and understand what they are going through. This is one of the
And
points
it's
I
not
wanted
just
to
about
raise.
being against
Okay,
men.
for example,
but it's
domestic
about
violence. Okay,
an
we have members
interpretation.
that deal with domestic violence, and they come to us with example case studies. And one of the things that they keep telling us is many of the women are saying that our husband justifies the violence, and he justifies it and says it's allowed in Islam. Now, where is that coming from? I know that Islam does not
This would be a
promote
man who
it,
doesn't
but obviously,
actually
where's
speak
that coming
Arabic.
from?
Or maybe culturally very biased. I'm seeing a couple at the moment who are having trouble.
I
The
just want
man
to
has
bring Margot
created a
back in.
circle around her
No,
saying,
there's-
you can't go anywhere else outside this circle.
There are imams and scholars who've written books saying how to beat your wife without leaving a mark on her body.
Which
What's
book have
that
you seen in
about?
that
Well,
one? There
there
are,
are
there are,
scholars
there
that
are.
do that.
That-
You need
nobody
to
has
do
can't
written.
deny
Nobody
that
has written a book. They may have
are.
spoken about it. That's a bit exaggeration. There are
That is
people.
not
People have
exaggeration.
spoken about it. I know they should be
There are
condemned.
videos on YouTube.
Well, you just said Ruqaiya
YouTube
has
is not a book.
scholar.
Come on, yeah.
No, Ruqaiya has just said that she has seen such a book. So let's not dismiss each other's
Yeah, sure.
arguments.
I've seen
If
many books.
If I could bring in Margot, we're having a heated discussion here as to whether such a thing as feminist interpretation exists even within Islam. What would be your answer to that?
Certainly, there have been women interpreters of Islam for many centuries, and there's a scholar at the Oxford Institute for Islamic Studies, I think it's called, Nadwi, or at least he was a visitor there, and
Nadwi, yes.
he has a book of
Akram Nadwi.
of women historically who have functioned as muftis, theologians, teachers of male alims and female alims, and so on. So it's a long history. In terms of
So you'd say it's not a modern phenomenon. This is not some kind of Western
it's not,
feminist
yes,
invention. You would take it from within the
there
tradition
have
itself.
been women interpreters for many, many centuries, and if you even want to go back to Aisha, she was, as she was collecting the deeds and words of her husband, she was also, engaging in some kind of analysis, if you want to put it that way. In terms of the modern period, I think it's very inappropriate to write off these women who were trying to find their way into the religion that people like Sheikh Mohammed Abdu was encouraging. There is, in more modern times, there was Aisha Abdurrahman. She was an alim. There are a host of women alims today from Al-Azhar, which opened its doors to women in the 1960s. There is also Nazira Zainuddin, who wrote a book in the 1920s from Lebanon, and she was reinterpreting the Quran. There was Nana Asma'u, who was an educated woman at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century in Sokoto in northern Nigeria. So we have many, many women there, and who were well educated by various, mostly male alims, the ones in the modern period. Now, the question of feminism, I think it's very important for people not to speak through ignorance or their own stereotypes about Islam, about Muslims, about ijtihad, about jihad, or whatever. I think it's also important not to go off and say wrong-headed and stereotypical things about feminism. I just don't think it's on. And when I made my intervention before, just now, I didn't use the word feminist. I can use it or I don't have to use it because it's all about looking at seeing Islam and believing in Islam as an egalitarian religion and a religion of justice. And it's a tool. And if people don't understand what the tool is and they want to detract and denigrate, it doesn't help the issue. But we don't have to use that word. And yes, interpretation matters a lot. There's a woman called Laleh Bakhtiar, and she's published a translation of the Quran a couple of years ago. It's in paperback, and it's very available, in which she used, if you will, a non-patriarchal language in English. And I read Ali Yusuf's, that's the first Quran that I ever read.